So who are you?
I'm Ben Hammersley. I do many things. I'm mostly a futurist and a journalist and a broadcaster.
If you had to choose one label, what would it be?
If I had to choose one as in what's the best description, or if I had to choose one as in that's what I'm going to do for the rest of the day?
To describe yourself. I mean, maybe there's a label that crosses all those other labels. Explorer? Inventor?
Yeah, no, definitely no. I mean, if you wanted to be particularly pretentious about it, Explorer is a good one, but, I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and things like that, but it's very difficult. I have this problem all the time. People always ask me what my job title is, and it really depends on the sort of work I'm doing. And all of the different job titles are all tainted in their own particular way. So a lot of the stuff I do is journalism, but if you say you're a journalist, that comes with certain amounts of baggage. A lot of the consulting work and stuff I do is futurism or scenario planning or something like that, which is, again, comes with a slight set of baggage and weird implications because the word is kind of bullshit. Broadcaster sounds a little bit like actor, singer, dancer, model. Technologist is pretty close, I guess. And the other thing is that I'm constantly reinventing or constantly iterating what I do, and I'm in the middle of a process of doing that right now. So I'm a pilot, for example. I'm a flying trapeze artist. I'm about to start a course as a paramedic. All of next year, I'm studying for a maths and physics degree. And so then sometimes I get accused of being a polymath, and that sounds terrible, because that sounds like one of those sort of terrible sort of 14-year-old boys who have breakdowns when they're 22. So I don't know, whatever you want to say.
Well, what do you spend most of your time doing at the moment? Let's say in the last couple of months.
So professionally, I'm doing futurism and huge amounts of consulting and speaking around the world. It sort of comes in season. So over the past few months, it's mostly been consulting and speaking professionally, and then privately, it's been studying for my pilot qualification. Over the past couple of years, it's sort of been split between that sort of speaking and consultancy and broadcasting. So I did a big TV series last year and a load of radio stuff. So it's a sort of a combination of the two.
I've just been reading about a project that I believe you worked on with your wife called the Serendipity Engine. I'd love to know about that.
Yeah, well, you need really to speak to her about that. So the Serendipity Engine was totally a project of Alex's, really, which was a sort of a physical exploration of the concept of serendipity, and specifically it was around the ideas that Google and many other large search engines at the time were talking about, which was that they wanted to manufacture serendipity. And this came from I think from their point of view, this came from there's a return of the pendulum away from the personalized stuff. If you remember 5 or 6 years ago, there was a strong push in everything from search engines to marketing to journalism. There's this idea that given enough data about the individual, you would be able to personalize your individual in a way that would be incredibly compelling. You had targeted marketing, targeted advertising, and you had personalized news or personalized content, and to a certain degree personalized search results, for example, from Google. And I think what was really sort of understood by Google far more in advance of it's been understood by, say, the marketing industry, was that sort of targeting is basically impossible. The content becomes incredibly dull and not very compelling, and so you have to add in this sort of serendipity, these sort of happy mistakes. You have to add in a certain level of random input, gives stuff that sort of spice and interest, and so it's very interesting to play with what you can use different inputs into somebody's sort of personalized results. And this, for me, tied in with all sorts of interesting things around, say, the psychology of cold reading and the psychology of mentalism and all of those sorts of circusy, fake psychic things. You could use clues from people, and you could use certain small facts that people would easily give over, and you could use them to create what would appear to be incredibly compelling and incredibly accurate selections of content that they would then think the machine was somehow insightful or intelligent in a way that it really wasn't. And so it was exploring lots of things, but effectively it was actually a big suitcase with wooden panels in it, with switches and dials and knobs and things.
So could you argue that actually Twitter is doing that already?
Not really. No, because you curate it yourself. So, I mean, Twitter sometimes tries to add in things into your feed. They've been experimenting with that. It's interesting to see how useful that is for people and how annoying people find that. It's one of the dilemmas that Twitter has, really, in terms of what actually is it. Is Twitter a sort of a place you go to get interesting content, in which case adding things into your feed is sort of a bonus and an acceptable thing? Or is it a place where you go to communicate with your friends and acquaintances? It's not acceptable. And I think Twitter, for different people, is different things, but certainly, for example, the way that I use it means that sort of intervention by Twitter is deeply unwelcome. But I think it's how acceptable that is depends on how you use Twitter. So it depends on how public or private a space you think Twitter is. For many people, Twitter, that sort of meddling with the newsfeed is very bad.
So what do you see, just as a final question, what do you see the applications of the research that you both did on this project?
Oh, no, it was just for fun.
Oh, right, good enough reason.
It was just an entertaining bit of, messing around, really. I started off as a journalist, so I was I started travelling around Asia. When I left school, I went to China for a couple of years and travelled around Asia, and then I came back to London, and I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies there to do politics. And whilst I was there, I got an internship at Associated Press Television, which is a big TV news agency, and at the end of that internship, I became a freelancer there and was a TV news producer. And at the same time, I was writing for the Times newspaper. So after about a year or so, I became staff on the Times and was the internet reporter for the Times. So I was writing for the paper about the internet. This was during the sort of 97, 98 .com bubble. And so I was reporting for the Times, and then I started doing quite technical stuff at home, and I ended up writing technical manuals and programmers' guides and so on. And then in the early 2000s, I left the Times and went to the Guardian. And at the Guardian, I did a couple of things. I was a reporter, working as a reporter, and then I was also building things for them. So I'm doing a lot of technology work, and for example, I built their first blogs, and I built their blogging platform, and I built Comment is Free, for example, which is their big political site, and I built their sort of multimedia, what was the beginning of their multimedia journalism thing, which enabled me to use that as a reporter to go and do a lot of reporting from war zones. So I went to Afghanistan for the Guardian. Previously, I travelled around. I'd been to Iran and I'd been to Burma. I went to the Philippines and covered the civil war in the Philippines for World Service. I went to Beirut and took photographs of Hezbollah and places like that. And then at that time I was living in Italy, running my own little sort of studio in Italy, in Florence, where I was making things for The Guardian, and I was doing a lot of writing and writing books. And then, so I had this weird three-pronged career.
So how did you move into technology? Because you studied politics, and then you found yourself writing about technology. How did you actually move into being able to do it, as it were?
It wasn't a matter of moving into it.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't really a matter of moving into it. It was a matter of it was always there. I'd always had huge amounts of tech around me. I've been online since I was 11 or so, in the pre-internet days, talking to bulletin boards and things like that. And I'd always had huge amounts of tech around me.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really a matter, to be honest with you, the technology thing was just that was something I knew about.
So did you, for example, teach yourself how to code?
Yes, but I've been teaching myself how to code since the age of about 11. But then I really sort of kicked it up a gear when I was about 22 and started, at that time in the sort of early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s of the web, it was a very, the culture at the time, the technical culture at the time was very much around teaching yourself to code and learning these things. Because a huge amount of it had yet to be developed, and so with a little bit of application, and you could learn to code, and you could actually become, you could actually add to the state of the art. So I ended up, like I say, building things for the Guardian, but I also wrote books, and I wrote the first textbooks on a couple of technical standards called RSS, which have gone on to be very successful, and so yeah. And one of the reasons for sort of upping my coding game, as it were, was because I realized at that time, in the late 90s, that if I was to be writing about technology for a national paper, I needed to be 3 or 4 levels above the level at which I was writing.
Yes.
I couldn't just be, just a regular reporter reporting on tech, because as many of my other national newspaper colleagues were.
Yeah.
They'd previously been general reporters or motoring correspondents or something like that, and then been moved into technology when the advertising money suddenly appeared. What I wanted to do was have a deep technical background in order to be able to sort of not make stupid mistakes in my writing. And so there was a combination of, it was something I'd already done, I was already doing, it was something that I wanted to be very, very good at, and it was something I really enjoyed. And so those 3 things sort of came together. That sort of led to this parallel track of being a technologist as well as being a journalist. But it also meant that I could leverage that into enabling me to do the sort of journalism that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I did a deal with my boss at The Guardian that I could, there was one particular system that I built which enabled us to put video and text and so on together online, and which at the time was quite a big deal, and I was able to parlay that into going and doing the sort of reporting I wanted in Afghanistan, for example. So I had this sort of weird triple track sort of career of being a regular reporter, being a technologist, and being a war correspondent. And later on, that led to lots of other parallels, because understanding, for example, how the different business models of the internet work, how innovation models work, how disruption works, for example, it has very many parallels with counterinsurgency, with terrorism, with all of those sorts of foreign policy. And so a few years later, when I was working, for example, when I was consulting to Downing Street, or when I was working for the European Commission, or when I was giving talks to advice on different technical stuff, and the same with the Foreign Office, there are very many parallels between the way that, say, counterinsurgency works and the way that, say, technological disruption works. These things reinforce each other if you're working within similar paradigms. And so talking about the digital revolution on the one hand and talking about Islamic fundamentalism on the other would seem to be completely different subjects, but in fact they have an awful lot in common with each other, and there's an awful lot that that both sides can learn from each other.
You made some interesting predictions about where the next potential terrorist threat might come from.
Did I? When did I do that?
I'm not sure of the date, but I thought it was an interesting thought that you felt that the next potentially major threat will come from socially disconnected 40-year-old who.
Oh right, yeah.
You remember?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not. I don't think that's a particularly radical thought. So, for example, I'm talking to you here from Los Angeles, right? If you look at all of the mass shootings or acts of political terror that have occurred in the US over the past 10 years, since 9/11, say, the absolute vast majority have been disaffected white dudes. I mean, the terrorist threat in the West, I would say, is massively weighted. In reality, is massively weighted towards the right-wing, white supremacist, disaffected working-class white male who have been, and to not to sympathise with them in any way whatsoever, but as a group, and specifically in North America, as a group, you can if not sympathise or empathise with their pain, but one can understand where it comes from. And this is the same in the UK as well, in that you have a whole demographic grown up thinking that they are in charge, thinking that they are special in some way, and thinking that they are privileged and owed a living, right? And for the past 20 or 30 years of globalization, of multiculturalism, of feminism, of all of these things have taken away that illusion. It was always bullshit, but it's thoroughly taken away from it. And so when you see disaffected white supremacists in the southern states of America, or whether it's UKIP voters in the UK, what you're seeing is the result of progress, basically. What you're seeing is and you're seeing the sort of a multi-generational stropiness from less educated white guys who think that the world should be theirs and don't like the fact that it isn't. Now, in the US, there's also a culture of guns and violence, and so and access to such things. So that makes it much more likely that they're going to pick up a gun and start shooting people than it would be in, say, the UK. But okay, you'll still have the rise of the far right. And so I think when we're talking about terrorism or political violence, if you look at any of the statistics, it's the vast majority of acts of terrorism, political violence are perpetrated by disaffected middle-aged white guys, without a shadow of a doubt. The reason that this isn't a conversation that is held very much is because the reasons behind that disaffection are so complex and involve so much of a reassessment of so much of society that it's so much easier for everybody concerned to just say it's all Islam. Or it's all about.
What we're talking about now is violent behaviour, and one of the things that you've also written about is the overall decrease in violence across the world. You felt there was potentially a correlation between that and cybercrime. Interested in hearing more about that.
That's a different matter. I mean, that's a different matter.
Yes.
In that there's a certain, when you're talking about violent crime.
Yes.
As opposed to acts of political violence.
Of course, yeah.
Then certainly, if you're the Russian mafia, it's much easier and much more lucrative to steal money digitally than it is to steal money by knocking off a post office. That sort of thing. That's definitely a trend. But in terms of political violence, there's a whole lot more of it. And there's a whole lot more of it because there's a whole lot more disaffection and access to weapons. It's almost an epidemic. It's almost a psychological epidemic. Here in the US, there's been a mass shooting every day for nearly 400 days, and not to mention burning of churches or the burnings of the vandalism of mosques or Sikh temples or the non-shooting related violence, casual racism, and all of that. But that's a different matter.
Yes.
I wouldn't call that a sort of
No, of course not. Yeah.
Bank robbery. That's a social transition that people are finding.
At the beginning of the conversation, you described yourself as an applied futurist.
Yeah.
Clearly, you work across many different areas in that respect. This project focuses on the motivations other than commercial of founders of startups. Could you tell me a little bit about Onward's Friend?
Well, that's just really the company. It's the company that does where I do my consultancy through. And the motivation for that is just that it's really one of lifestyle design. That I want to have a particular type of life, and I want to work in a particular way, and I want to spend my time and energies in a particular way. And that basically means that I have to do it myself. It's very difficult indeed, but it would be impossible, I think, for me to have the lifestyle and do the sort of work that I want to do whilst working for someone. And so starting my own operation was just necessary because of the things that because it enables the things that I value the most.
And yes, absolutely. You're working on a near space project, I believe.
Yeah, so this is the area that I'm sort of rapidly moving into and away from a good deal of the stuff that I do otherwise. The big industry, the industry that I'm most interested in at the moment, and have been for a long time, is the space industry. We are about, with my futurist hat on, I could give you the lecture, but we are on right now we're seeing the beginnings of what I think is a 40 or 50 year explosion in our capabilities in space. And there are lots of reasons behind that. There's the technological advances that we get from lots of other industries coming together with technological advances in launch technologies. So you have companies like SpaceX and so on who are building much cheaper launch platforms. plus the general sort of set of new visions of what is possible and what we can be doing in space. So here in Los Angeles, where I live, there is a very large space community of commercial companies who are starting to develop all these things, and so that's what I'm doing as well. So, like I say, because of all of the other lifestyle things that I want to achieve, sort of projects that I'm doing are very small, and so the smallest space projects that you can do are very small satellites, and so either near spacecraft. So, for example, over the New Year break, I'm launching a near spacecraft, which is a very, very high altitude balloon, which will get right into the edge of space, basically, and do some science and take lots of pictures. And then, with the success of that, hopefully that will then move us on to doing low Earth orbit satellites, which will be genuinely in space, and then that leads on to space on projects over the next 10 years. It's really, I spent the last decade talking about innovation and talking about the future of media and working with all of those different things. And to be honest with you, I sort of sat down, and I think it was really with the birth of my daughter, I looked at marketing and startup or innovation and disruption and all of this sort of thing, and just thought, well, this is mostly bullshit. And so, decided to actually build things that go bang, don't go bang, build things that go up. Because I think there's a real danger, certainly for me, there's a real danger that we can be talking about this stuff in a far too meta way, especially around innovation and digital disruption. I went through a period when I was advising various governments on innovation where I was every other week I'd be in a town or a city that was attempting to make itself, market itself as the Silicon Valley for X, right?
Yeah.
The new Silicon Valley for the English Channel, or the Silicon Valley for Belgium, or the Silicon Valley of the North, or the Silicon Valley of the South, or whatever.
Yeah.
This sort of cargo cult innovation, where they think if they put in a nice coffee shop and some beanbags, suddenly they'll have. And it's an entertaining way to spend a couple of years, and it's certainly lucrative, but it's bollocks.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the founders of startups are using a startup to market really important things. For example, cancer diagnostics. They're creating a technology startup in order to market that, to create that and then market it. So, the world of startups is quite broad, isn't it?
Well, sure, but to be honest with you, for every oncology PhD who has to start a new company in order to be able to get their innovation to market,
yeah,
there are 150 social media consultants, or especially if you go to San Francisco. If you look at all of the real high-profile sort of
yes.
web things. They're all apps to replace the mothers of 22-year-olds. They're all things they're all startups which are scratching the itch of that particular demographic of pretty well-off graduates. They need their laundry doing, and they need food delivering, and they need the hand-holding when they go to the post office, and that sort of thing.
So you're very cynical about that type of startup?
Well, I'm cynical about it because for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because they're perfectly entertaining businesses, but I don't think they're something that should be on the front cover of magazines. I don't think they're that exciting. I'm much more interested in the cancer startup or the space exploration startup or something like that. But secondly, I think those sorts of businesses are a symptom of a massive venture capital bubble. And we need to be very careful differentiating between the symptoms of a bubble and genuine, far-reaching innovation that you get with, like you say, a biotech startup or a new innovation. One of the things that frustrates me greatly about talking about startups is that all of the statistics, all of the studies show the most successful entrepreneurs are people in their late 30s to mid-50s who have been working within an industry for a while. They have the contacts and they have the context, and they also have an understanding of a problem within that industry, and they have an insight or an innovation which makes that problem a bit better. So they're surgeons who come up with a new technique, or they're car designers who come up with a revolutionary new idea to make a car a bit better, whatever it is, right? But they're people who are working within industry, have the context, they have the understanding of the industry, and they have an incremental improvement. Then they spin out of their current organization, and they create a startup in order to create the new thing, and that's what pushes those industries along. And those are invariably very successful. The innovation sort of mythos is the 22-year-old white dude coming out of the desert with the tablets on, with the answer to everybody's prayers, in that they're the new Zuckerberg or something like that. And those guys think that they are changing the universe, but actually the vast majority of them are fodder for a venture capital churn. They're just coal to plot into the furnace, really. In wunderkind startups. I'm much more because 999 times out of 1,000 they are total nonsense. They're very lucrative for their seed funders, because there's always a greater fool, right? But I'm much more interested in the 40-year-old surgeon or researcher, or somebody with a real basis for their life.
And changing the world for the better, presumably.
Well, not even necessarily for the better, but at least it's a real thing, rather than just some sort of copycat food delivery service with no vowels in it. That sort of thing just bores me rigid. But the genuine innovation is really, really interesting.
As one last question, if this isn't asking for free information, what are your predictions as far as the sort of wider business market are concerned for the future? I've read an article that you wrote about people's working space and how open plan doesn't work. Do you have any predictions, for example, working hours, where people work from, so on and so forth, for the future?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's about to be something of a wreck, certainly in the UK, that many people have jobs which aren't really jobs. They aren't really work. Either because what they do could be automated, or that what they do doesn't really add value. And I think that combination of automation that comes with artificial intelligence and just ever increasingly connected devices, combined with the realization amongst a lot of people that a lot of the softer things like marketing, for example, are mostly bullshit, will lead to a really catastrophic hollowing out of the middle class. And you can see this coming down the line for various industries. So, for example, we are without a shadow of a doubt going to have self-driving trucks on the roads very soon. And when that happens, it's the clock is then ticking for the trucking industry, and it's supporting business. And that's quite a few people. That's a lot of people. It's quite a few million people in the US. It's hundreds of thousands of people in the UK. There's all these knock-on effects from that, and so the future of work from pretty dire. There's a whole class of people that when their jobs are automated away, it's going to happen very soon, they really have nothing left to do. So the challenge for anybody working today is to line themselves up for the next few decades with work that both adds value and which only they as human beings can do. And that's the major challenge, I think. That far too many people are doing work which isn't really work.
And if you had to suggest to students which areas and which to go into that you would see as being safer than the ones you mentioned, what would those areas be?
Well, it depends on their individual talent. Whatever that they're able to do where they can add value. But I think myself that if you're doing a general across the society scenario, in the UK the biggest issues are going to be healthcare, because we're about to have a huge bubble of old people, and that can't be done by robots. So, if you wanted to future-proof yourself for the next 30 years, go into elder care or something like that. Or I would have hard skills, so engineering, medicine, maths, physics, biology, sort of hard skills, rather than marketing or, those sort of softer persuasive things.
Yes.
Because unless you can actually genuinely demonstrate why you as an individual are adding value, I think you're somewhat screwed in the medium term, because all of the trends are heading towards either automation or analysis, and the analysis will show that you're not adding value. There's a longer piece to be written, there's a longer piece to discuss here about, for example, the upcoming crash in the advertising market, for example, where all of the to bring the conversation full circle, we were talking about personalization and so on earlier. That involves enormous amounts of statistics and data about the individual consumer.
Yes.
And that's a really dangerous thing for the advertising industry to go down. Once you go down that route, you realize after a while that most of the stuff that you do isn't worth. And that's a real difficulty because there's huge amounts of, specifically the media industry, there's huge amounts of the media industry which only exists because the data isn't very good. If you actually had genuine readership data about magazines, for example, or genuine viewership data about TV advertising, for example, then those industries would collapse because the way that the industries sell themselves to each other is based on a whole tissue of falsity. And nobody wants to be the first person to point out that nobody looks at the ads in the magazine because, for example, if you're the first person to point that out, you bring the industry down.
Yes.
But that sort of thing is inevitable. The centre cannot hold with those. Look at anything I would look at any industry that looks as if it's disruptable, and I would back away from it very quickly. And then that again, if you're talking about the medium term, then we haven't factored in things like climate change and the geopolitical actions from that. So ridiculous. So as a sort of a final example, the geopolitical reaction to Syrian refugees in Europe is tragic from a humanitarian point of view in the short term, but it's doubly tragic from a humanitarian point of view in the medium to long term because all of the countries which are turning away refugees are precisely the countries that need new people to go and live there. The UK, for example, needs a lot more immigration. It just needs it. Right, because it needs those people. Because everybody, the studies all show that immigration, for example, is a net economic good in the short term. So they don't cost money; they actually make money, but also that those people are going to be very necessary because we just don't have enough people to pay the taxes to pay for the healthcare for all of the old people that are about to, all of the middle-aged people are about to become old, and that's doubly true in Italy and Spain, and bits of parts of France. And so those countries which are sort of turning away refugees, for example, are being total bastards in the short term, but they're being complete idiots in the medium because we kind of really want those people because highly motivated, highly skilled, highly educated, very thankful to be here, right? So they sound great. Let's have more of them. But actually, in the short term, that's politically very difficult. And so that question about so what should people at university now be thinking about doing with their lives? They need to be thinking about it much more widely and not in the same context as advice they might get from their parents about which is inevitably 20 or 30 years out of date. But they need to be thinking about what the world is, making models in their head of what the world's going to be like in 10 or 15 years time. And in 10 or 15 years time, in the UK, there's a huge demographic problem, and there's going to be increasing problems with the weather and things like that. And so they can be solved together, but they can only be solved together. How you as an individual fit in that is a matter of wide imagination.
Ben Hammersley, explorer, applied futurist and correspondent, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.